started with a phone call that made no sense. A mother's voice shaking on the line, saying her son was dead. Then moments later, another call from the son himself, claiming he was the one in danger. Two stories, completely opposite, both filled with fear, both accusing the other of something unthinkable. By the time police arrived, one man was dead, and the truth was buried under lies, blood and a family bond that had completely collapsed. This is the murder of Lanny Horowitz, a case where a mother and son would turn on each other, each claiming innocence, each pointing the finger, and each hiding something far darker than anyone could imagine. Lanny Horowitz was known as a difficult man, but not an invisible one. He had a loud personality, a history of strained relationships, and a reputation for crossing lines. Those closest to him described him as controlling, argumentative, and unpredictable. But no matter how complicated Lanny was, no one expected his life to end inside his own home, surrounded by people who shared his blood. Especially not in a case where the two main suspects would be his own mother and his own son. The Horowitz family had been fractured for years. Arguments were common, grudges lasted longer than they should, and every disagreement seemed to leave scars instead of solutions. Lanny lived in a house that was less a home and more a pressure cooker. Tension filled every room, conversations easily turned into shouting matches, and silence often felt more dangerous than noise. Friends would later say that something bad was inevitable, that the anger inside that house had been building for far too long. On the day Lanny was killed, nothing appeared unusual from the outside. Neighbors noticed no screams, no sounds of struggle. Nothing that suggested a violent crime had taken place just feet away. Inside, however, Lanny had suffered a brutal death. He was found beaten, his body showing signs of a violent confrontation. This was not an accident. This was not sudden illness. Someone had attacked him with rage, and whoever did it knew him well enough to get close. Police were immediately faced with a nightmare scenario. Two people had been inside the home. Two people had motive. Two people had stories that didn't line up, and both of them were accusing each other. Lanny's mother claimed she was afraid of her own son. She told investigators that Lanny had become aggressive, unstable, and threatening. According to her, she had lived in fear for a long time, afraid that one day his anger would turn physical. She painted herself as a victim, trapped in a house, with a violent man. When questioned about the night of the murder, her story was emotional, detailed, and filled with panic. But there were gaps. Important moments were unclear. Certain details changed slightly every time she retold them. Then there was Lanny's son, who told a very different story. He claimed his grandmother was manipulative, controlling and capable of cruelty. According to him, she had a long history of emotional abuse and resentment toward Lanny. He insisted that his father had been trying to protect himself, and that the situation escalated beyond control. The son's version of events placed the blame squarely on the mother, describing her as the aggressor, not the victim. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't just a murder case. It was a psychological battlefield. Each statement was carefully crafted. Each accusation felt rehearsed. Both suspects showed signs of stress, but neither showed the clear shock detectives often expect after a violent death. Instead, there was defensiveness, calculation, and a noticeable effort to control the narrative. The crime scene itself added more questions than answers. There were signs of a struggle, but not the kind that clearly pointed to one attacker. Objects were out of place, but nothing definitively linked to a single person. Blood patterns suggested close-range violence, meaning whoever attacked Lanny was right there, face to face, during his final moments. This wasn't a random intruder. This was personal. Forensic evidence began to slowly paint a darker picture. Injuries on Lanny's body suggested repeated blows, delivered with force and intent. This wasn't a single moment of panic. It was sustained violence. Yet neither suspect showed obvious defensive wounds. No scratches, no bruises that matched a violent struggle. That raised a disturbing possibility. Could both of them be lying? Or could both of them be involved? As detectives dug deeper into the family's history, disturbing patterns emerged. Years of police calls for domestic disturbances, reports of verbal threats, neighbors who had heard screaming matches but never stepped in, text messages filled with anger, blame, and resentment. This family hadn't just broken down. It had been eroding for years. The mother's story began to crack under pressure. Timelines didn't align with phone records. Her movements around the time of the murder raised suspicion. Meanwhile, the son's account also began to unravel. His description of events conflicted with forensic findings. Certain injuries didn't match his version of how the fight unfolded. It became clear that at least one of them was lying. The terrifying question was which one, and why. Police now faced a case where the truth seemed intentionally buried. Every interview revealed new contradictions. Every piece of evidence pointed in two directions at once. The emotional weight of accusing a family member complicated everything. Detectives had to separate sympathy from facts, emotion from evidence, and loyalty from lies. As pressure mounted, investigators noticed something chilling. Neither suspect expressed genuine grief for Lanny. There were no tears for the man who had died, no memories shared, no sense of loss. Instead, both focused on self-preservation, on blame, on survival. It was as if Lanny had become a problem to be explained away, not a life to be mourned. And then came the moment that changed the entire investigation. A single piece of evidence, overlooked at first, began to suggest that the murder wasn't a spontaneous act. It hinted at planning, at intent, at a decision made long before that final violent night. Suddenly the idea that only one person was responsible began to feel too simple. Because in this house, hatred didn't belong to just one person. And the truth about who killed Lanny Horowitz was far more disturbing than anyone was ready to admit. As investigators continued peeling back the layers of the Horowitz household, the case began to feel less like a mystery and more like a slow reveal of a family that had been emotionally at war for years. Every interview, every document, every digital trace showed a pattern of blame shifting and control. The mother and son weren't just suspects. They were adversaries, each trying to destroy the other's credibility before the truth could surface. Detectives began focusing on the timeline. The hours leading up to Lanny's death were reconstructed minute by minute. Phone records showed calls placed and deleted. Messages that had been erased but later recovered revealed tension escalating rapidly. Arguments weren't new in this house, but on this night, something was different. The language was sharper. The threats were more direct. The emotional temperature had crossed a point of no return. When confronted with inconsistencies, the mother became defensive. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, repeatedly portraying herself as powerless. Yet evidence suggested she had more physical access to Lanny during the critical window than she admitted. Surveillance footage from nearby locations placed her movements closer to the scene than her statements indicated. Each contradiction weakened her story, turning sympathy into suspicion. At the same time, the son's version of events also fell apart under scrutiny. Investigators found that some of his statements appeared tailored to match what he thought police already knew. He changed small details when new evidence was revealed. A classic sign of someone adjusting a narrative rather than recalling truth. His calm demeanor, once seen as shock, now felt calculated. The breaking point came when forensic experts re-examined the injuries. The force required to cause the damage suggested not just anger, but familiarity. This wasn't the chaotic violence of fear. It was controlled, deliberate, and personal. Lanny had likely recognized his attacker in his final moments. That realization made the crime even more chilling. The possibility that both suspects were involved began to gain traction. Investigators considered a scenario where the confrontation escalated, where alliances shifted, where blame was later rewritten. In a house filled with resentment, it was no longer impossible to imagine that violence became a shared solution to a shared problem. When arrests were finally made, the public reaction was intense. How could a family implode this badly? How could a mother and son stand on opposite sides of a courtroom, each accusing the other of murder? The case drew attention not because of fame, but because of its raw betrayal. Blood ties meant nothing when survival was at stake. In court, the accusations turned brutal. Each side painted the other as dangerous, unstable, and capable of murder. Jurors watched as years of private hatred were exposed in public. The trial wasn't just about what happened the night Lanny died. It was about decades of resentment that had finally exploded. Prosecutors argued that the truth lay between the two stories, that neither suspect was fully honest, and that the murder was the result of prolonged conflict rather than a single moment of rage. Defense teams fought hard, attacking forensic interpretations and questioning investigative methods. Doubt became a weapon, used strategically to protect their clients. As testimony unfolded, one thing became painfully clear. Lanny Horowitz had been trapped in a toxic cycle of control, anger, and emotional damage. But being difficult did not make him deserving of death. The courtroom was forced to confront a reality that made many uncomfortable. Sometimes victims are flawed, and sometimes killers are familiar faces. When the verdict finally came, it left many unsettled. Justice in this case did not feel clean or satisfying. There were no clear heroes, no simple villains, only a family destroyed by years of unresolved conflict and a life that ended violently inside what should have been a safe place. The murder of Lanny Horowitz stands as a disturbing reminder of how quickly relationships can rot when anger replaces communication. When accusations become weapons and trust disappears, even family can become strangers. And in the end, the truth may never fully be known, because when everyone lies, reality becomes the first casualty. This case isn't just about who killed Lanny Horowitz. It's about how a home turned into a battlefield, how love turned into resentment, and how silence allowed violence to grow. A mother and a son, bound by blood, torn apart by blame, forever linked by a crime that shattered what little remained of their family. And somewhere between their conflicting stories lies the truth, buried beneath fear, guilt, and the devastating cost of betrayal.